Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 2 hours of stories. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Dropping a like helps out the channel immensely, and it does take just a quick second. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time. Yes, 2-hour videos just like this all the time. I do have a quick question for all of you. I'd like to know what your favorite story that I've ever narrated is. I think for me it's a really tough call, but if I had to go with one, it would probably be cursed VHS tapes and how to avoid them. I really enjoyed narrating that story. I felt very accomplished once I finished it, and I also just thought it was a great story, so I think if I had to go with one, it would probably be that. But I'd like to know what all of yours are. Anyways, sit back, do whatever it is that you do to relax, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Abby's shrill cries echoed through the hall, shredding through the thin veil of sleep I'd settled into barely an hour before. Alan rolled in place, groaning wordlessly as he folded the pillow over his ears. I stared daggers into him, scoffing to myself before wiping the sleep from my eyes and pulling myself from bed. It had been his job to put her down for bed last time, so I supposed it was mine to check on her. I shot a glance at the clock on my husband's bedside table, though I already knew what time it would read. 2 a.m., more or less on the dot. The clock read 2:03, right on schedule. Despite having dealt with the process every night for the past few weeks, it never got easier. It was as if our daughter had reverted back to her days as a newborn, rapidly regressing since turning 3. Things had been relatively easy with her over the years, but in the last few weeks she'd become more difficult than usual. There had been complaints about misbehaving at daycare, hitting other kids and biting, things of that nature, and we noticed it in our day-to-day life that she was beginning to grow obstinate. Where she'd once been an agreeable and rather easygoing kid, she was now difficult, often seeming to listen clearly, only to turn around and do the opposite of what she was told, or something entirely different and altogether unacceptable. It was like she was trying to goad a reaction out of people. One of the hardest parts to her challenging new behavior was her sudden inability to sleep through the night. It was like she'd found some new, messed up circadian rhythm all of a sudden. We thought it might be the new house, a side effect of having a young child in an unfamiliar environment, but it felt odd. She'd been fine for the first week or so in the new place. Heck, she'd seemed to love it, and then one night, a little over 9 days after we'd settled in, she began the nightly tantrums, setting off every night around 2 a.m., like she was following a schedule. Given the fact that Abigail was still relatively nonverbal, and couldn't really articulate herself in any other way, we dismissed the tantrums as anything other than commonplace. I shuddered as my feet met the wood floor, the chill of fall filling the room. I grabbed my robe from the foot of the ottoman beside our bed, throwing it over my shoulders as I made my way to Abby's room. The hallway was pitch black. Only faint traces of moonlight could be seen shining through the solitary windows. Even through the grogginess and irritation, a blooming unease found a home, growing with each protesting groan of the floorboards, and my daughter's shrill cry echoing off the walls. As my hand closed over the cool brass of the doorknob, my ears perked up unintentionally as my body tried to account for lack of sight. I heard something that made me freeze in place. Amidst the sound of Abigail's crying, I felt certain I'd heard a voice. For the briefest of moments, I thought it was her father's before immediately remembering I'd left him behind in the bedroom. My stomach dropped, a surge of sudden panic dissipating the final mists of sleep clinging to me. I threw open the door, heart pounding as I rushed forward and into the room. Quickly I made my way to the side of Abigail's crib, nearly tripping in the act as my foot fell upon something soft and plush. I looked down to see the large stuffed bear I'd assumed my husband had gotten her when we moved. She'd been clinging to it like a flotation device in water every time I'd seen her since. Upon assuring her safety, I set to scouring the room for any sight of intrusion. My eyes frantically darted about the little space, and for a moment my own reflection on the sliding mirrored doors of the closet made my heart jump. I quickly pulled open the closet, it being the only place in the room someone could hide themselves, to find it entirely empty. I meticulously scanned the room, as far as I could tell, undisturbed from the night before. The moonlight cast shadows across the carpet, making strange and forbidding figures of the mundane. It occurred to me that she must have tossed it out of her crib sometime during the night, and I wondered if that wasn't the reason for the latest of her nightly outbursts. As I picked up the stuffed animal sitting on the floor beside her bed, I found myself peering in through the thin wooden bars at my daughter. I felt a surge of relief as I saw her, though it was quickly replaced by a familiar sort of exhaustion as she cried, her little face scrunched and reddening, that I would be spending the next few hours of precious sleep time trying to get her back to sleep. I reached into the crib, gently lifting her from the bed and pulling her into my chest. Almost immediately, her cries settled into a soft babble, and I felt a flood of emotion I'd only known post-pregnancy, an overwhelming sort of love. I made my way to the rocking chair opposite the bed, settling into a rhythm as I began to hum a lullaby. At the back of my mind, I replayed those moments before I'd entered, questioning whether I'd really heard anything at all. I had felt so sure, in those brief moments before I'd entered, that there had been another voice. Yet the window was shut, and the room empty with the exception of my little girl. She was calm now, or no longer crying at least, but her eyes were wet and her nose was red, still running from her prior tantrum. She babbled softly, her head bobbing as she leaned back to look at me, her mouth trying to work around some word, a da-da sound. "Daddy?" I chuckled, despite the exhaustion rapidly regaining its footing. "No, not Daddy. He's sleeping. It's Mommy." She looked at me, as though somehow her little mind was unsatisfied with the response before turning and pointing one of her little fingers towards the crib. "Daddy." It took me a moment to understand what she was asking. As I stood and made my way to the crib, reaching in for the stuffed bear her father must have gotten her at some point, I felt her grip tighten around me as she spun away, hiding her face in my neck. Something in me twisted at that, a distant unease in my gut, instinctual though vague. I looked the ratty thing over with mild interest. For the life of me, I couldn't understand why Alan had chosen it for her of all things. It was a large, rather ratty thing. Clearly a hand-me-down in the line of stitching running along its belly told me anything. He'd likely seen it on one of those shopping trips at the local thrift shop as we tried to furnish our home on a budget, and thought of our Abigail. It was sweet, though a part of me wondered if he'd remembered to wash it. I made a mental note to ask him in the morning. It clearly meant a lot to Abby, and for the moment I'd noticed it, it had been practically glued to her hand, never to be anywhere she wasn't. which is why I found her reaction somewhat unnerving. I lowered the stuffed toy back into the crib, somewhat surprised by the weight of the thing as I did so, a bit heavier than I might have expected. Abigail glanced over her shoulder curiously, as if to ensure I'd moved the toy, turning around fully when she saw it back in the bed. I felt something stir in me that I couldn't quite place. Again, something odd in her reaction that triggered some instinctual sort of maternal unease in me. My eye lingered on the doll before searching the room once more for comfort and settling into the rocking chair with my daughter. It took several minutes for that faint unease to fade to the back of my mind, lingering silently under the surface, and it took a little longer than that for Abby's breathing to slow and sleep to fall over her again. I could feel the drowsiness billowing back up in me as well, my eyes feeling grainy, lids heavy as the faint creak of the chair formed a dissonant lullaby. The protesting groan of the floorboards and the search for the door's hinges pierced the veil of sleep that had come to settle over me. Suddenly I found myself going straight into defense mode, my mind immediately thinking back to the voice I'd thought I'd heard earlier. Even my eyes shot open. It took a moment to adjust to the darkness, and my heart plummeted into an icy pool of fear in my gut as the outline of a man grew apparent in the doorway, only settling once my husband spoke. "You coming back to bed, Leanne?" he asked, sleep audible in his voice as he rubbed at his eyes. I took a breath, allowing my heartbeat to return to a normal pace, before nodding. "Yeah, just had to get her back down," I said, doing my best to rise from the seat as carefully as possible to avoid waking Abigail. I made my way to the crib, slowly lowering her in besides the stuffed bear, before making my way towards Alan. "You okay?" he muttered, closing the door as silently as he could manage as we crept back towards our room. Some of that lingering unease must have been visible on my face, I realized. I shrugged, shaking my head as though to free my mind of the cobwebs of exhaustion. Yeah, I'm fine, just..." I shrugged, hearing that voice again in my mind, the sound so clear I had to wonder if I wasn't misremembering. Thought I'd heard a voice earlier, in Abby's room. Seeing the flood of emotions making their way to his face, I quickly added, "I checked everywhere. The room's empty. I think I'm just tired." He nodded but glanced back at the room for a moment, as if considering whether or not to check himself. I placed a hand on his arm, stifling a yawn. "It's okay. Alan, she's fine." He nodded, casting a parting look at Abigail's door before turning and heading with me back to our bedroom. I glanced once more down the hall, its darkness casting it in an unshakable eeriness, and did my best to assure myself Abby was all right despite the odd, vague feelings of unease still clinging so stubbornly. Sleep came soon after as we climbed back into the covers, and while I struggle to recollect my dreams from that night, I know they were dark, the sort to ensure my sleep was a restless one. Looking back, I wonder if it was my mind's way of warning me not to let my guard down, that the worst was yet to pass. "Cheerios or Frosted Flakes?" I asked, lifting both out of the boxes, raising an eyebrow as I asked Abigail for the third time which of our two kinds of cereal she wanted. I'd already had to clean up a bowl of oatmeal from the kitchen floor that she'd tossed in a little fit of rage. The question only prompted more tears, her face growing a bright red and wrinkling into a silent scream, as though she were building up for another bout of shrieking. That moment had been especially challenging. Abigail was acting out even more than she had been in the past few weeks, to the point that Alan was offering his apologies on the way out of the door. knowing that I'd have to wrangle her all alone, while also trying to manage my online classes. By the time afternoon rolled around, I was at my wit's end. My nerves were so far beyond frayed that every noise seemed poised to send me into a fit of irritation. Class had started, and despite moderate success for a few hours, Abby had set back into one of her tantrums again, this time showing no signs of stopping. There was a test that day, and after spending most of the time juggling between my class and Abby, I did something I knew better then, and hated doing. I flicked on the television, turning to the first YouTube playlist I saw featuring familiar kids' characters. Mommy just needs 20 minutes, baby. Please just watch TV, okay? I'll be right back. I left her in front of the living room television, hurrying to shut myself off in the room before too much time could pass on my exam. I did my best to stifle the flood of emotions I felt as I heard her cries grow louder, tottering behind me. As I entered the small room off of the living room, which I had been using as an office, I closed the door behind me. Abby's cries rose into shrieks, her little fist pounding against the door. I swallowed hard, sighing as I fought back the watering in my eyes. Just 20 minutes. She'll be okay for 20 minutes. I tried to remind myself, every bit of me wanting to open the door despite my exhaustion. I remained steadfast, making my way to the computer and beginning work. After a few minutes, she stopped, her cries falling into pitiful sniffles before I could hear her totter away. I tried not to rush through my test, my grade in the class already having suffered from so many sleepless nights. Yet my mind wavered between the work and thoughts of Abby. I pushed through, eventually losing myself in the test as it grew in difficulty, until I'd reached the end, falling back in my chair with a sigh. I turned in place, spinning the seat to face the window that made up most of the wall. Outside, I could see the neighbor lady, Mrs. Janice Melody, as she'd told me to call her, and her husband in their yard. Their ancient old pickup shone in the driveway, a unique shade of orange that could be described as something of an eyesore at best. She was watering the grass, despite the fact that the Illinois weather almost certainly meant some more snow could be expected before summer. Well, he passed out popsicles to a few of the local kids, a group of boys taking a break from their play. They'd been playing a game of street hockey, which I'd tried to drown out while working, but watched with some mild interest as my mind drifted to thoughts of the future. It wouldn't be too long before Abigail was out there. I could almost see her in my mind, a perfect mix of her father and I, smart and sweet, but with an attitude to boot, out there with the other kids. After a moment, Mr. Melody, I'd yet to remember his name, appeared to return to his house, disappearing to the side of my window and out of view. I watched for a few minutes as the kids continued their game, his wife stopping her busy work every few minutes to yell at them when the ball touched her lawn or some similar offense, remaining lost in thoughts of the future. It was as one of the children fell, scraping a knee and crying out, attracting the attention of one of the parents, that I realized, with a feeling of dawning horror that any parent knows. It had been too long since I'd last heard Abby. The few times I've had to lock myself away to get work done, she settled in the living room outside the office, distracting herself scrolling through YouTube and playing with the assortment of toys we'd gotten her over the years. The sound of her little babbles or clattering of toys was something I'd listen for at points to make sure she was all right. I had gotten distracted, first by the test, and then my own thoughts in the first real moment of silence I'd had all day. I had let the time get away from me, forgetting completely to keep an ear out. I shot up from my seat, hurrying to the door, yet feeling unable to move fast enough for my heart as it pounded in my throat, feeling every bit a shoddy parent. "Abby?" I called, swinging the door open to the sight of an empty living room. My breath caught in my throat. The only sound to greet me was the antics of whatever cartoon characters came over the television. I hurried to the kitchen set, calling her name as I checked behind the island in the off chance that she was playing some random game of hide and seek. Yet, as I went from room to room downstairs, without a sign of her, I felt my heart grow painful in its thunderous beating. A faint nausea ripped at me like a dog at the heels, as a faint tremor began to emerge through my body. "Abigail?" My voice came more forceful than I'd intended, shaking more than I'd have thought. As my face grew hot, I searched the first floor, every room coming up empty, the tremor growing until I shook like a leaf in the wind. As I approached the garage door, I was greeted immediately with a gust of frigid air and the sounds of birds chirping. My heart dropped, disappearing into a pit widening in my gut as I saw that it was somehow ajar. My body seized with awful anxiety as I opened it fully. The garage was wide open, having a full view of our neighborhood beyond. My knees shook with the threat of giving way entirely, as a sensation like being doused with freezing water almost turned my body to ice. Had it not been for the adrenaline that coursed through me in that instant, searing my veins as it did so, I might have passed out from the sheer horror of it. It didn't make sense. I was sure I'd heard my husband close it this morning. Had she opened it herself? There was no way. I felt certain. The button was several feet above her head. Besides, surely I'd have heard it. I could see no way for her to have somehow opened it without my notice, and yet the reality remained the same. I cursed myself for getting distracted. "Abigail?" I shrieked her name, uncaring who I disturbed as I ran out and onto the driveway. I searched, eyes darting about with no idea of where I ought to be looking, the world descending into a blur of colors, sound, and panic around me. The taste of salt was my only warning that tears were falling. My face, every part of me, feeling numb, like television static had seeped beneath my skin. I could see curtains parting as curious and judging eyes cast glances through windows, wondering about the crazy woman disturbing the peace, but none seemingly willing to venture forth and see what was wrong. I felt lost, unsure of which direction I ought to be going or where to run, suddenly aware of just how small I was in the vastness of the world. The small groves that lined either side of the street, beyond the yards forming a barrier between the outside world, usually so serene and beautiful, now seemed like treacherous forests, past which I could picture my daughter falling into some ditch crying out for me. Or if she'd somehow made it through the brush, out onto the busy streets on either side. I felt as though I could vomit at the thought. I rounded the left side of my house, entering the space between my yard and Miss Melody's. Panic racked my thoughts for every step I took, carrying with it the fear that I was moving farther from where she might be. All the while, another part of my mind wondered if she wasn't still in the house, somehow having escaped my thorough search, and by leaving, I was putting her in danger. "She's gone. She's gone. You're an awful mother. She's..." The thoughts played on repeat like some record of a nightmare. The very blood rushing through my head, audible as my heart pounded. "Abigail?" I called again, struggling to take in a deep breath as my lungs seemed to quake at the sheer dread, as though the act of taking in oxygen was something requiring concentration I couldn't spare. The sound footfalls in the grass made my head spin as I turned to face whoever was approaching. I could have cried at the sight of Miss Melody. Despite the sour look the old woman fixed me with, disapproval written within the wrinkles of her face. In the arms which strained with the effort, she held Abigail, clutching in her hands that ever-present little stuffed bear. "Oh my God, thank you." I sucked in a breath, hiccups racking my chest as the tears poured, rushing forth to take hold of my daughter. She pulled back, putting a shoulder between the two of us, her eyes never wavering from mine. It was as though she were trying to see through me, searching for some reason not to return Abigail to me. "Please?" I tried to sound as polite as I could manage, but the edge in my voice was apparent, and I could only imagine how I must have looked in those openly reproachful eyes. I didn't have to see my face to know it was red and splotchy, my hair a mess still from the morning since I'd had no plans of stepping out, screaming like a banshee only moments before. "Where was she?" I asked, watching Abigail as she chewed on the ear of her teddy with a feeling almost akin to the moment of her birth. An awful anxiety suddenly lifted, though I waited uneasily for her to be returned. "My backyard," she spoke, her tone no more pleasant than her expression. "Making an absolute mess of my garden, I might add." "I'm so sorry, I took my eyes off of her for a minute and she was gone. She interrupted, hardly even acknowledging I'd spoken. "Just keep your child away from my house. Do you understand me? And keep an eye on the girl. You never know what might happen if she wanders off again. Whoever finds her next time may not nearly be as cordial as myself." Her tone was as cold as ice, and even more biting. No hint of friendliness or subtlety in her words. I couldn't tell if it was a stern warning or a threat. She stepped forward, forcing Abigail into my arms, before appraising the two of us. Then, with a shake of her head, she trudged back down the little hill that sloped into her yard, and into her yard out of sight. I clutched Abigail close, tears trailing into her hair. The air smelled sweeter, the wind a gentle caress, as my mind lingered on what could have come to pass. "Don't do that again. Don't ever leave me again like that," I sobbed. "How did you get out?" She raised her toy, little arms wavering a bit beneath its weight. "Daddy," she cried, before flinging the bear as far as she could manage, sending it tumbling barely a foot away into the grass. I sighed, leaning over to grab it, before making my way back towards the house. My stomach gurgled, the adrenaline fading, leaving only exhaustion, nausea, and anxiety in its wake. I could see the peering eyes through windows, as my neighbors watched through slits in curtains, and my face burned hot. As I entered the garage, I cast a parting look in the direction of the Melody's home, towards the backyard and the grove beyond. As I did so, I caught sight of someone in one of the windows on the second floor, the side nearest my house. I glanced up and caught an eye of Mr. Melody. He was watching me with a look I couldn't read, but one my mind immediately defined as judgment. Casting my eyes away, I made my way inside, heart thudding in my chest. The rest of the day passed by in a blur. No matter what I busied myself with, my mind continuously returning to that afternoon, replaying every way that things could have gone wrong. I didn't let Abigail leave my sight. She spent most of the day in the living room, where I set up the old playpen we hadn't used in months. Unwilling to have a repeat of earlier events, I couldn't make sense of it. how she'd ended up outside, knowing there was no plausible way she could have reached that button. It made me deeply uneasy. If she had found a way outside somehow, I couldn't afford to ever let my guard down. Even a bathroom trip could offer her the chance to slip out. The hours seemed to crawl by, me never leaving her side, before Alan returned from work. "Hey," he'd called, stirring me from a sleep I wasn't aware I'd even fallen into as he strolled through the garage door. My eyes darted about the room, searching for Abigail, my heart immediately in my throat, pounding with unrelenting intensity. It wasn't until I realized that she was on the couch beside me, her little form curled against the arm of the chair, fast asleep, that I could breathe again. "You okay?" Alan asked, slowly lowering his bag as he crossed the room towards me, opening his arms immediately as I fell into them, head shaking without thought. I recounted the events of the afternoon, my test and the resulting distractions, the panic upon the realization, and the brief confrontation with our neighbor. By the time I was through, tears were running freely. I bit my lip, feeling irritatingly fragile. "Get a hold of yourself," I thought, chiding myself silently. I didn't like how off I felt about it all. It was more than just the fact that she had gotten out, as horrifying as that had been, but it felt like there was something more, something greater that I was failing to see regarding my daughter, and it petrified me. Alan's reaction was a struggle to read, a multitude of feelings seeming to display themselves all at once: concern, shock, and perhaps it was just my conscience, but I thought I could see a bit of blame in his eyes. Still, he hugged me tighter. "It's okay. She's okay. We're fine. You just can't let her out of your sight again, I guess." He kneeled in front of Abigail, kissing her lightly on the forehead, as to not wake her. "I'll check out that garage door. Maybe it glitched or something," responded to a neighbor's remote, and bang, out she goes. I nodded. Though the thought felt unlikely, it brought comfort to have some sort of theory. "We should take something over to them. A thank you gift. Maybe it'll smooth things over. We don't want to seem like the dysfunctional family in the neighborhood." I winced at the idea. The very thought of having to see the old woman again making me flush with embarrassment, but I knew he was probably right. She had found Abigail after all. Regardless of what her attitude might have been, surely I owed her for that. I nodded, sighing and running my hands across my face as if to wipe away the events of the day. Alan pulled me close again, pressing his lips against the top of my head. "It'll be fine, love. Promise. She's okay. Everything's okay." God, how I wish he had been right. We settled in for dinner half an hour later. Before setting Abby down for bed, I stood by her crib for what felt like half an hour, caressing her head as she fell back into a deep sleep, arms wrapped around that massive stuffed bear. The old heating system of the house had seemed to kick into overdrive, and Alan had suggested leaving her window open to allow for a little breeze. After some resistance, I relented on the condition that we lock it in place, opening it no more than an inch. The events of that afternoon lingered fresh on my mind, and I wouldn't open the door to allow for a genuine tragedy. I watched her for a few moments as she slept, my heart aching at the thought of what might have happened. After some time, long after the sounds of my husband moving about the house had faded, I made my way to our bedroom and climbed into bed beside him. I pressed in against the heat of his body, though my back was facing him. My eyes were on the doorway as if somehow it might allow me to peer into her room. though there was little to be seen but the darkness of the hallway. At some point, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and I could fight to keep my eyes open no longer. My thoughts growing loose and sporadic as the fog of sleep grew heavy. I don't know how long I had been out, when the commotion of the house snatched me from my slumber. The room was dark when I pulled myself into a sitting position, eyes still bleary and rough with like sandpaper. Yet I had no time to gradually awaken. The sound of my daughter's cry, a shrill shriek like nothing I'd heard from her before, and Alan's voice bellowing my name turned the blood in my veins ice. Alan? My voice was strained, and hardly recognizable through the panic that filled it. My heart felt as though it were plummeting through my feet and into the earth, pounding all the while as I struggled to stand. My head swam, the air thick with a dreamlike quality that, when paired with the stomach-churning anxiety, felt altogether nightmarish. Alan? I was near the point of tears as I approached her room, the sound of her shrill, pained shrieks making my chest ache sharply. I pushed the door aside with such force it made the wall shake, the sound loud enough to make my ears ring. And yet, as Alan turned to face me, standing beside our daughter's crib holding her close to his chest, his expression bore no surprise, just a blazing panic and sadness. "What's wrong? What's going on?" In my hurry, I nearly tripped over that god-forsaken stuffed bear, the side of my foot where I'd kicked it, stinging as though I'd just kicked a small rock. There was something there, something inside of it more than fur and stuffing, and I had no time to dwell on the matter. As I approached, I could see the reason for all of the commotion, and my stomach dropped through the floor. Her arm. I couldn't finish the sentence, feeling as though the air had been knocked from my lungs. Alan cradled it close to him, not wanting to let the limb dangle, but I could see the state of it even then. It was swollen, the entire arm an angry red color save for an area a bit below her wrist, which stood out a nasty purple. The tremor I felt seemed to rise until I was shaking uncontrollably, nausea growing at my gut as darkness played at the corner of my vision. My head swam as the panic reached a fever pitch. What happened? How did this happen? I don't... Questions stampeded over each other to the forefront of my mind. I felt lightheaded, and my skull pounded with every drumbeat of my heart. The world felt so odd and surreal, as though I were in a nightmare, like I could wake up at any moment still in bed. But no, it was all very real. I could tell. "I don't know," he responded, voice strained with emotion, neither of us taking well to seeing our child in pain. "I heard a slam, and next thing I know she's screaming. She had to have climbed out of her crib somehow and lost her balance. He looked at me, confusion and a sort of pain I resonated with, on a primal level that seemed to grow with her every cry. She's never done that before. I don't understand." I shook my head. He was right. Abigail had never shown any signs that she'd been trying to climb out of her crib. Had she, it would have been moved to our room that same day. Until now, I wasn't sure she was even capable. It made a small part of me, some minor area still capable of questioning through the sheer panic, wonder why. Why tonight of all nights, after the somewhat inexplicable events of that afternoon? Still, I had no time for weaving theories at that moment. Alan had risen to his feet and was speeding past me towards the door. "Where are you going?" I asked, yanked from my thoughts. Hospital? We've got to get this looked at immediately. I nodded, almost feeling stupid that I hadn't thought to suggest it sooner. My head felt all over the place, the events of the day rendering me mentally drained. I just wanted to curl into a little ball, Abigail safely at the center, and sleep for a week. I'll come with you, I started. Just let me throw some pants on. The drive to the hospital was a tense one. I sat in the back with Abby, doing my best not to lose it as I tried and failed to calm her down. Not a second going by that Alan wasn't peering nervously at us in the rearview mirror. The night seemed to move on in a blur of hurried conversation and odd glances. Perhaps it was my exhaustion, but as we sat in the waiting room while our daughter's arm was scanned, it felt as though every glance spoke of judgment. In my sleep-deprived mind, in some odd way, it seemed like everyone knew of the events of the day before, my failing, as though the world itself was calling me negligent. And I was beginning to question it myself. What is happening today? I breathed, running my hands across my face and through my hair as I leaned into Alan's shoulder. I could feel him shaking his head as he put his arm over my shoulder. It's been something, he said, voice every bit as tired as I felt. She's getting older. Maybe the terrible twos are showing up a bit late, he offered. I thought for a moment, knowing there could be something to the theory, the sudden temper tantrums and disappearances, and how this incident with the crib, it was all so sudden and unlike her, and my every instinct told me that something was wrong. And yet, I couldn't tell what. It felt like that afternoon all over again, an awareness that my daughter could be at great risk, yet an utter directionless when attempting to confront it. Mr. and Mrs. Price, the doctor who had presided over Abigail's treatment, called us from across the waiting room, yanking me from my thoughts. Alan was up in an instant, striding across the room in quick pace as I hurried to follow behind, heart pounding in my chest as a nauseating effect. The expression on his face was polite but slightly somber, and I already expected what we would be told. There was a break, just below her wrist in 2 places. Her little arm had been shattered by the contact. The doctor's best guess was in line with our own. She'd likely fallen and broken it in the process, but the mental image sent me back into tears. I know it's upsetting, believe me, but if it's any consolation, little ones are remarkably resilient. She'll likely heal faster than either of you would in a similar circumstance, he said with a sad smile and nod. We'll do our best to make sure her arm is set perfectly. I've got a friend who specializes in pediatric orthopedist. He's one of the best. She'll be safe in his hands. I'll have the front desk give you the number. Thank you, Alan responded, reaching out and shaking the man's hand. The doctor nodded. They'll be bringing Abigail out in a moment. You folks try to get some sleep tonight. She'll need the rest too. The medicine will have dulled the pain, but she'll be tired. I imagine you all are. I simply nodded, still somewhat lost in thought. The doctor affixed me with a tight-lipped smile, the sort that was more apologetic than happy, before turning and beginning to back down the hall and on to the rest of his night. He paused as he reached the hallways, and in that instant I could see something like reluctance in his posture as he turned to face me once more. Accidents happen. You shouldn't blame yourselves, he said, though looking at me directly as he did so. I felt my face run flush, realizing my thoughts must have been all but visible on my face. The self-loathing apparent even to a stranger, but also If you think there might be something wrong, listen to yourself. You know that little girl better than anyone in the world. I'm sure sometimes that alarm bell in your head is going off for a reason. Trust your instincts, Mom and Dad." With that, he was gone, leaving me with only a parting smile and enough time to nod my acknowledgement as he disappeared behind a set of double doors and deeper into the hospital. I peered over at Alan, skin prickling with an eerie sort of sensation like some warped deja vu. "That was nice of him," he said with a thin smile, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. "I'm sure it's standard. We're definitely not the first distraught parents he's dealt with, but cool of him all the same." I nodded again. While logically, I knew his words were likely little more than some standard platitude fed to all the worried parents, I couldn't shake how much it resonated with what I'd been feeling since that morning. It was disconcerting, to say the least, and only added to the feeling that I was missing something in plain sight. Loose pieces of a puzzle all scattered about my mind with no ability to be connected. "I take it you're the parents?" a shorter woman with a round face called. The sight of Abigail in her arms scattered any and all previous lines of thinking, as both Alan and I hurried to meet her. I scooped her from the woman's arms as gently as I could manage, holding her as one might some restored artifact that would fall to dust in a heavy breeze. Alan handled the rest of the interaction, being led to the front desk as he was asked about insurance information, while I returned to the car with Abigail. I had had enough for the day, enough of the fluorescent blaring lights of the hospital, and of people and their judgmental gazes. I crossed the silent parking lot, passing an older man in a wheelchair taking a smoke outside, the click of my shoes on the pavement echoing through the night. I'm not certain at what point I became aware of that sensation, that stomach turning, creeping feeling like a skeletal hand along the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. At some point, I slowed down, heart thudding heavily against my chest, ears straining as I listened to the footsteps I'd slowly grown aware of. My stomach sank as they slowed in turn. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, paired with the stress of the day rendering my nerves shot, leaving my mind unable to think clearly, but in that moment, with Abigail in hand, all I could think to do was speed up. The area of the parking lot I'd entered was empty as far as I could tell, save for myself, my daughter, and whoever was behind me, and the realization filled me with a cold, heavy dread. My pace quickened until I was practically speed walking. All the while, I could hear the echoes of footsteps following not too distantly. In between my own, realization struck me like a blade in the dark. They're following me. Somebody is following me. I broke into a run. To my horror, the person behind me soon followed suit. I wanted to scream, to shriek out for help, and yet in the moment I felt robbed of words. Panic flooded my every mental pathway, as I could think only of one thing: get Abigail to safety. I ducked to the right, moving between a van and a parked ambulance, and darted out in front of it, doing my best to use the vehicles to shield me from my pursuer's view. My head spun. Moments from every true crime podcast or murder show I'd seen playing out in real time. My arms ached with the effort of carrying my daughter while running, and I struggled to balance her with one arm while I grabbed the keys with the other, clicking the panic button as I scanned the cars around me for any sign of mine. Several rows ahead, I could hear it, and to see the blare of its lights glowing from behind the other vehicles. It seemed all the motivation my body needed to conjure up some extra bit of speed, as I could hear the footsteps behind me approaching. The car came into view, one row ahead, the sight of it making my heart lurch. Every second spin covering the distance between it was excruciating, and every hair on the back of my neck was at attention, prepared to feel someone yank me back. I was nearly there. I could almost reach out and grab the handle when I felt the hand on my shoulder firm, nearly making me lose my balance. "No," I shrieked, finally finding my voice as I spun around and tried to fight my captor, only to feel a firm set of arms pull Abigail from my grasp. In my panic, I felt my boots catch against each other and I fell back, sliding back against the car and onto the ground with a force that made my teeth clatter. "Leanne, it's me. Relax, baby. It's me." Even through my terror, I recognized Alan's voice. Immediately the fear dissipated, giving way to a strange and overpowering sorrow. I fell into his shoulder, the tears running freely as I did so. I was drained, both mentally and physically, and in the moment I wanted to cry, vomit, and pass out, perhaps all at once. I didn't mean to scare you like that. I saw you running and I got worried, so I hurried to catch up. What were you running from?" I looked up at him, unsure of how to respond for a moment. There was some part of me that felt suddenly quite foolish for how I'd reacted, almost certain I'd perhaps blown things out of proportion as we sat there alone in the parking lot. I shook my head. "I thought I'd heard someone. It's nothing. Let's just go home." I could see in his face that he was worried, but knew better than to push any further, which I appreciated more than he could know. "Okay," he nodded. "I'll get her in her seat. You just go ahead and try to doze off." I nodded, smiling though I felt no humor in it, as I began to round the car for the passenger side door. It was as I was climbing into my seat, pulling the door shut with a groan, that I peered out into the world beyond the window, and felt my heart stop. I swallowed hard as I stared at the vehicle exiting from the parking lot only a few yards away, caught for just a moment beneath the streetlights, as it turned onto a quiet residential street. It was immediately familiar to me. An old pickup in a shade I could only recall seeing once before, in the driveway of our neighbor's house. Old Mrs. Melody, the very woman who had brought Abigail to me that afternoon. The realization made my stomach turn, and somewhere in the back of my head, I could hear the doctor again. "Sometimes that alarm bell in your head is going off for a reason. Trust your instincts, Mom." At that moment, though I could find no way to prove it, my instincts told me that something was going on with the woman next door, and I feared, somehow, my little girl was involved. That night, despite my exhaustion, I doubt I slept more than 3 hours in total. It was a light sleep, with every stir of my daughter in bed snatching me from my slumber, as I would shoot up, scanning the darkness beside me until I was certain she hadn't awakened. I wasn't sure when, if ever, she could go back in that crib. I couldn't see myself feeling safe leaving her in her room, alone again for a long while. At the very least, until we could be sure she wasn't attempting any more midnight escapes. And God only knew how we would manage that. I couldn't even be sure of when this had started. At some point during one of those moments, sitting in the silence of the room, listening to the breathing of my husband and daughter over the continuous drone of the ceiling fan, the hope of sleep seemed to escape me. I sat in the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the faint light pouring through the windows, a combination of the moon and distant streetlights all I had to see with. My eyes lingered on the stuffed bear, sitting at the edge of the bed like some sentry standing watch. From the moment we'd returned, Even through the mental slur of the painkillers, it had been the first thing she'd mentioned, and Alan had brought it to the room for her. I had moved it at some point, after rolling on to the thing only to be awakened by the sensation of it digging into my back. Something in it firm and hard, complete with some pointed edge I could feel. The sight of it there in the dark, sitting there unmoving, with its blank eyes peering forward seemingly through me, made me feel a strange sort of distress. I'm not sure how much time passed with me tossing and turning in the vain hope that sleep may lie in the next position, but I found my eyes kept lingering back towards that bear. I glanced beside me, confirming that both Abigail and Alan were sleeping soundly, as I edged towards the end of the bed. With one quick motion, I booted the thing off the bed, those eyes watching me accusingly. It hit the ground with a thud that made me grit my teeth, peering back to ensure my daughter remained asleep, and muttering a silent thanks that she had. I glanced over my husband's sleeping form, at the digital clock on his nightstand. 1:55, it read. Only 5 minutes or so away from the time of our daughter's nightly tantrums. The thought brought me on a great sense of foreboding, that I couldn't shake lying there in the darkness, massing in my chest like the tangle of so many weeds. Perhaps it was the result of a day of mishaps, leading me to feel there could only be something worse around the corner, and feeding my anxiety like trees and dry brush to a forest fire. It was ridiculous. I was certain of it. I rolled over, placed my hand across Abigail, as though it could bring me all the security I felt lacking in that moment. She was there, hurt as much as it killed me, but safe. I couldn't see her waking up in the next 4 minutes. I laid back and forced my eyes closed, doing all I could to drag myself back to sleep. It had only been a few minutes. My ears turned to the alternating sounds of my husband and daughter's breathing, and the whirring creak of the ceiling fan as I'd begun to drift, when I heard it. At first I was certain it was my imagination. The sound was so faint, I could almost dismiss it as such. But no, it was far too persistent. A strange mechanical hiss, like someone had switched on a broken television somewhere in the distance, that echoed out amongst the whirring of the fan and usual murmur of the house's inner workings. Before I could even identify a source, I felt my heart pounding furiously against my chest. My eyes fell back on the glowing display of the clock. 2 o'clock. The timing, it seemed strangely intentional. I could feel a chord of unease struck, reverberating through me with a chilling effect as my ears perked to listen closer. I sat up, wavering in my mind between waking up Alan or not, settling quickly on the latter. He had to be up in a few hours, and while I felt unsettled, I saw no need to disturb him yet. Instead, as carefully as I could manage, I slid out from beneath the covers and stepped gingerly out of bed. The wooden floorboards creaked their protest, making me grimace as I watched Abigail stare. After seconds passed without another movement, I felt okay to chance another careful step forward. My ears felt tuned as I listened for that sound. Louder, it seemed. Now that I was really listening for it, I could think of nothing in my room that could be responsible for it, save for perhaps the white noise machine I hadn't used in months, and that was much louder. No, this sound brought to mind something else. It was oddly reminiscent of the static one might hear on a walkie-talkie, or something of the like. I had owned one during my childhood, which I'd used to talk to some of my friends in the neighborhood, and as I inched across my bedroom floor, gripped by the quiet and frigid night air that seemed to hang heavy in the room. It was all my mind could conjure. I stepped forward again as delicately as I could manage, my eyes scanning the dim light as best as they could, though I was relying almost entirely on my hearing to guide me. That mechanical hiss was growing louder with each step. Somewhere to the right of me it seemed, near the foot of the bed. I could feel my heart in my throat with every footfall, my mouth running dry as the hairs on the back of my neck rose with the creep of anxiety. It was louder now, so much so that I was beginning to worry it might wake my family. A series of cracking and popping noises, audible amongst the hissing. It seemed to be coming from more than one place. Though the noise faded in and out, I was almost certain it was coming from 2 different directions. The thought made my skin crawl and the pit of my chest widened, as though I was being surrounded by something unseen. My home invaded by specters I could only listen for. It was then that I heard it, faint but unmistakable, a voice from amidst the disembodied static. Hello? In that moment, I could have sworn my heart stopped. An icy shock tore through me as though I had just been submerged in freezing waters. My eyes scanned the darkness, wide and searching for anything that might be the source of the sound. Babe? I leapt, nearly losing my balance as I stumbled away from the sudden sound, only to glance over and see Alan sat up in the bed. He looked tired and confused more than anything, hands running over his eyes, but after a few minutes I could see that he too could hear it. What is that? Little bear? You there? I sucked in a breath, head spinning with such force I was certain I might fall out from the sheer panic starting to flood my system. That voice again amongst that phantom static, raw and hissing. Our eyes met, and I felt a surge of some gruesome satisfaction that I wasn't alone. He heard it too. Are you there? I spun to face behind me, certain I could hear that voice drifting from somewhere over my shoulder, and found only an empty room to greet me. From behind me again, the static grew louder, and for the first time since it had appeared, I could pinpoint from where. My eyes fell on the baby monitor on our nightstand. Its lights glowed with the hiss of the audio, sparking with color the louder it grew. Alan followed my gaze, snatching it up in one quick motion, before pressing the button to respond. Who is this? There was a shrill sound, like the squeal of audio feedback that made us both cringe, and set Abigail to stirring immediately, followed by an echo, as though his voice was being played back simultaneously from somewhere else. Somewhere nearby, ceasing only when Alan released the monitor. In an instant, it was all gone. The air hung heavy with an electric sort of surreality, like the early moments of some waking nightmare, yet there was nothing but the usual sounds of our home to fill its void. The room was silent, or as close as it could be anyways. Abby had begun to kick up. Though still asleep, she was starting to wake. The sounds finally growing too much for her, and I could hear the beginnings of a tantrum building as sleep began to wane. For several moments, Alan and I lingered in place, our eyes locking, a coiling tension passing between us both. In an instant, a thought crossed my mind, and before I could even think things through clearly, it was out of our room and hurrying across the hall towards Abby's. The door loomed ahead, as ominous as a gravestone, my mind fully prepared to meet the intruder I knew must be on the other side. I could all but see it, some figure clad in shadow, hunched over the baby monitor in my daughter's room. The thought filled me with terror and a rage like nothing I had ever felt. It was the only thing I could think of at the moment that made some sort of sense. It was obvious that whoever we had just heard had been trying to speak to our daughter, and I could think of no other way we would have heard them over her monitor. "Leanne, where are you going? Stop, wait." Alan's footfalls grew heavy as he rushed ahead of me, putting himself between me and the door. He shook his head, eyes locking with mine, a look that was part confusion, but a majority of visible worry etched on his features. "I'll check. You stay behind me. We don't know who might be in there." I nodded, still nudging him forth until he was pushing the door open. As we pushed into the room, my eyes fell immediately on the nightstand. The baby monitor was untouched. Alan began to search the room, flicking on the lights and checking under the bed and in the closet. All the while, I found myself lost in thought as I looked at the monitor. I was all but certain it had to be the source of the voice, and yet there was no one. The thought should have been comforting, but it only made my fear grow thicker. "Awake, little bear?" Alan shot up, stiffening as he turned to face me. Our eyes locked, an unspoken terror shared between us as the two of us hurried back to our bedroom. "What is going on?" Alan's voice betrayed the discomfort we were both feeling as he grabbed the baby monitor from the nightstand. "Who is this?" he growled into the receiver. "I swear to God, I'll..." "Just turn it off." I couldn't take it anymore. That sound, the way the air seemed uncomfortably heavy with a strange sort of unearthliness. He stared at me, reluctant, before finally switching it off. The device went silent, and yet for a few moments I could have sworn I still heard it. That faint hiss of static still hanging in the air, persisting somehow despite the monitor being off. A squeal like the feedback of a microphone pierced the air, making the both of us jump. It was gone, as soon as it had started, leaving only the thud of my heart and a buzzing unrest in the air in its place. Abby began to stir, angry coos soon turning into a full-out tantrum. Alan and I said nothing, neither knowing what could be said to do away with the strangeness of the night. "I'll take care of her," I finally said, scooping her up and off the bed. "Okay," Alan said, his voice hard with a sort of anger I'd never heard from him before, as he busied himself yanking the cord out of the wall and gathering the components of the baby monitor. When he finished wrapping the cord around the monitor and shoving it into his pocket, he faced me with a sigh. "I'm gonna look the house over. Be sure there's no one here. After that, I'm throwing this out." I nodded. Well, it was clear he was agitated, the events of the night finally wearing down his nerves. I didn't feel as if he was wrong. It felt like, even then, I could still hear that voice. A man's, rasping and old, echoing in my head as it beckoned for some little bear. "I'll try to get her back to sleep. Tomorrow, I'll call the police to file a report. Maybe see if they'll come out and..." I shrugged. "I don't know, scan the house or something?" He nodded, making his way towards the door, where he paused to face me. "Stay here with her. I don't know. Something doesn't feel right about this." "Okay." With that, he was gone. I listened as best as I could to the sounds of his footsteps moving about the house, my heart on edge that at any moment a sudden commotion might ring out as he stumbled upon some intruder. When none came, I let myself settle into the rocking chair we'd placed in the corner of the room, trying my best to soothe our daughter back to sleep, cradling her injured arm close. Alan returned minutes later, His eyes glistened with a look of utter rage. In his hands dangled a series of wires from which hung various smaller gadgets. I didn't want to ask what they were. Some part of my mind already knew the answer, and was horrified by the implications. "Radios," he finally said, in a voice that was strained with emotion I'd never heard from him before. "A bunch of radios. One in her room, one in the living room, and a camera in the garage." I felt my skin crawl as my eyes began to wander the room instinctually. The thought that there had been cameras in my house without my knowledge made me feel ill. All of a sudden it felt like from every corner there might be eyes watching. Distant perhaps, but watching me all the same. "I'm calling the cops now," he continued, though his voice seemed to have drifted into the background. "And the realtor tomorrow. It's ridiculous. It's invasive. He trailed off, and I could see his eyes on Abigail in my arms, glistening with tears I knew resulted from a feeling of frustration and powerlessness. "I'm calling them now," he finally said with a sniff and a nod, gathering himself as he grabbed his cell phone and made his way out of the room. I just sat on the edge of the bed, head swirling with half-formed thoughts and eerie suggestions. The memories of the day before, Abigail's escape, and my apparent encounter with whoever had been following me in the parking lot, all seemed content to gnaw away at my sanity. Strange and paranoid thoughts began to force themselves to the forefront. Lack of sleep, terror, and the paranoia of discovering I had, in my own house, been watched and listened to by somebody, served as ample kindling for their fires. The police were at our house nearly an hour and a half later. Alan walked them through the events of the day, everything from my escapade that afternoon to the inexplicable events of the night. 4 officers were dispatched. 2 stayed with Alan in the living room listening to his account of it all. The other 2 I led from room to room as they searched the house. "Do you guys have any idea what this could be? How can we find out who's behind this?" I'd asked, as I led them from the laundry room and up the stairs towards Abigail's bedroom. One of the 2 officers accompanying me shrugged. A short Hispanic man with kind eyes and a wide face. "We can't be sure of anything, ma'am. We'll get the devices your husband gathered into the tech guys and see what they can determine." He pursed his lips, giving an apologetic smile as though he could tell the answer wasn't what I wanted to hear. Still, I nodded, leading them into Abigail's bedroom and flicking on the lights. "This is our daughter's room," I said, "where she was sleeping when—" I didn't feel it in me to recount the events of the previous night again, the very thought draining. The other officer nodded, stepping past me and beginning his search of the room. "If you have the means, you might consider staying in a hotel for the foreseeable future." He kept his voice low, and in his expression I could see a level of care his sterner partners felt lacking. "I'm a parent, 2 daughters. One of them barely older than your little girl. I know how scary this has to be. I'll do my best to make sure we stay on this." I could have hugged the man in that moment, Officer Ramirez, according to his badge. He'd been the only of his colleagues to treat the situation without an almost clinical sort of coldness, and it made me feel somehow less hysterical about it all. "Thank you," I muttered, wanting more to say but finding nothing. He nodded before joining his partner in the search. They were gone 15 minutes later, Officer Ramirez leaving Alan and I a number to call if anything else unusual happened. And with that, my little family was alone again in a house that suddenly felt so much less like a home than only that morning. Any hope of sleep was long gone, and I spent the next few hours pacing the bedroom and hallway. Abigail in my arms, my mind moving faster than my body could manage. Alan tried to stay up with me, but with work in only a few hours, I encouraged him to get some sleep around 4, promising that Abigail and I would stay close. We did, spending the hours until light began seeping through the blinds and dusty rays in the rocking chair, until my eyelids grew heavy and sandpaper-like. "You gonna be okay here today?" Alan asked me, his eyes watching me through the standing mirror while he worked at his tie. "You can always go stay at my sister's today. Tracy would be fine with it if—" "I'm fine, Alan," I interjected, exhaustion robbing me of any tact. My voice sounded harsher than I'd intended. I'm fine," I repeated, softening my tone a bit. "Maybe if she's free, I'll call Tracy later and see if she can watch Abby for a bit while I get some sleep," I offered. Alan frowned but nodded, seeing clearly that there would be no point in an argument. As he completed the final buttons on his shirt, he made his way over to us, kneeling down to plant a kiss on Abigail's cheek and then my own. "We're gonna be okay. I know last night was—" He trailed off. "But we're gonna be fine." I nodded, smiling, though his expression failed to reach much of my face. As he rose to leave, making his way for the door, a thought occurred to me. "That stupid bear you got her. Can you bring it here?" I asked. "I think I threw it in the crib when the cops were here. Sorry. I'm exhausted and just really don't want to get up and risk waking her, so I can listen to screaming for the next 3 hours." He fixed me with a quizzical look, and for a moment I wondered if, in my exhaustion, I'd misspoken somehow. Finally he smiled, chuckling to himself. "Sure, boo. I'll grab it, and I don't know what you mean I got her. I'm tired of her lugging that thing around as much as the next guy, but don't put the blame on me." I felt my eyebrows raise, mouth opening in search of the question I felt struggling to form through the fog in my mind. But he was gone and off in search of the bear, as if responding to the sudden rush of my thoughts. Abby stirred, cooing to herself in her sleep, and in my heart I knew I would stand between a train, a bullet, or anything else for her. "Here it is." Alan's voice stirred me from my thoughts. The sight of the large stuffed teddy making my skin crawl, my gaze moving to those cold eyes from the night before. "Thank you, love. Can you just leave it here?" I nodded beside the chair, and he obliged. He placed his finger under my chin, tilting my head up for a final kiss before heading for the door. As I watched him leave, I felt a vague sense of déjà vu, and his words from before seemed to drift to the forefront of my mind. "I don't know what you mean I got her. I'm tired of her lugging that thing around as much as the next guy." He was being humorous, that much was obvious by his tone, and yet it didn't seem like he would lie about that detail, even as a joke. It was too minute, too random for him to simply be teasing me. I wanted to call him back and inquire further, but the groan of the garage somewhere below told me the opportunity had passed, and with my phone across the room and a sleeping baby in my arm, I relented on the idea. Instead, I found myself staring at the bear. I realized I had never really taken the time to look it over. Why would I? How often does anyone deeply examine their children's toys? The thought had never so much as occurred to me. However, now that it was, details previously taken for granted suddenly seemed odd under scrutiny. It was big for a stuffed animal, almost half of her size, and unwieldy as all get out to have her constantly carrying. As I leaned forward slowly, reaching for the toy while trying not to wake Abby, I felt the wrap on her injured wrist brush against my skin. sending an awful chill through me that momentarily dissipated whatever unsavory thoughts I might be having of getting rid of the thing. I grunted under its weight. With only one arm free, it never ceased to amaze me the weight of the thing. I raised and lowered the stuffed bear, gripping it by the ears, as though somehow my arm might realize it had masculated how heavy a pile of stuffing and fabric ought to be. Perhaps it was the accumulation of paranoia after a night of events that would serve to make anyone paranoid. Or perhaps it was a far too delayed reaction of that mother's instinct. I can't be certain. All I'm sure of was the disquiet I could feel creeping through me like the unwanted caress of cold fingers against my back as I struggled with the unnatural weight. I twisted the bear so that its back faced me, moving my hands through its fur in search of any sign of a zipper or button or some sort of opening. As a child, I could recall the first time I'd received a fancy toy of any sort. It had been a doll from my parents, one of those electronic ones that could cry and babble like a real baby, and I could recall just as easily having it taken away after flinging it at my sister during an argument. I hadn't meant to hurt her, but being a kid, I'd failed to account for the small plastic box at the center of the toy, which housed all of its electrical components, and the resulting gash it caused had me grounded for half of the summer. As I searched Abigail's toy, my arms starting to quake with the prolonged effort, I could almost feel the weight of that doll again from all those years ago. I adjusted my grip, grabbing the toy around its stomach and pressing down. My heart jolted, settling into a rapid pace as I felt my hand close around something hard and square. My eyes immediately settled on its stomach, on the thin line stitching that I had hardly taken the time to notice before, assuming it to be a sign of wear and tear. Now it seemed almost threatening. I stood from the chair and carefully made my way over to the bed, settling Abigail at the center of it as gently as possible. Before heading over to Alan's bedside table, I pulled the drawer open, rifling through all of the miscellaneous junk, old chargers, and ancient mail, before finding what I was looking for, a rusting pair of construction scissors. It was the only pair we had in the house, despite many a mental note to buy another, and necessary to what? Despite intense mental debate, I knew I was going to do. In the back of my mind, I could already hear Abigail's future tantrum when I had to deny her the bear, until I could manage to sew it back up. But in that moment, all that mattered was finding an answer to the question at the center of my mind. I pushed the tip of the scissors blade through the faint line of stitching across its stomach, cutting carefully along each of the stitches until an opening large enough for me to fit a few of my fingers was made. For a moment, I found myself pausing over the stuffed animal, a strange sort of apprehension gripping me from inside. I needed to know, to abate the fears forming in my mind, every bit as disquieting as they were unclear. Without another second of hesitancy, I pressed my index and middle finger into the bear, digging through its inner workings. Mostly cotton and what looked to be old rags were shoved beneath its skin to fill the stuffed toy, until my finger fell against something cold, hard, and plastic. I tried to get a grip of it, struggling and failing not to widen the tear as I forced my hand in after whatever lay at its center. I listened closely for Abigail's sleeping breath, the only sound over the faint rip of fabric, as my hand closed around the object. It felt like a box of some sort. Running my fingers up its shape, something seemed to extend from one of its corners. It was thin, a thread perhaps. No, whatever it was, I was certain it felt of plastic, not yarn or any sort of cloth thread. No, this felt more like A wire. My heart kicked into motion like a prize racehorse, sending an icy hot wave of adrenaline washing through me. I gave up on any sort of care, the breath in my throat coming quick and uneven now, as I set to digging through the stuffed animal like wrapping paper, until what lay inside was revealed. I pulled hard against the box, feeling a great bit of resistance from within, straining until, with a sudden pop, it shot loose, nearly sending me careening off the bed. As I collected myself, I looked over what I held. It was a small white box, maybe 4 or 5 inches across. On one side, a series of holes were placed in the same configuration one might see on a phone or a walkie-talkie. On the other sat a switch, unlabeled. I immediately recognized the design of the thing, or something of the sort at least. It was eerily similar to that which had been inside of my own doll years ago, except that was meant to be electronic. As far as I knew, the stuffed animal was meant to be only that. Beyond all of that, there was one difference between the object I held now and that I had seen in similar toys. I felt my mouth run dry. The wire that extended from it was a pale green, and when I saw what dangled uselessly at the end of it, my stomach tightened like a fist. Hanging from the end of the pale green wire sat one of those cold, glassy eyes. The thoughts in my head descended into a hurricane of thoughts and things I ought to do. Call Alan, call the police, burn the thing, and yet I sat staring as if somehow it might change the disturbing reality of what I was seeing. It was a camera. I had no doubt about that. A camera lens made to look like the glassy eye of my baby girl's stuffed bear. My hands shook with such force. I was certain I might drop the thing, and my stomach flipped 180 degrees. I quickly grabbed the eye, closing it in my palm, the fear that somehow it might still be active, and whoever was on the other side watching me making my skin crawl. My chest ached with the racing of my heart as I pulled until my arms strained, until I heard a snap and the eye broke free of its wire. I stared at it for a moment in my hand, the object making a faint mechanical whirring that grew quiet by the second, and all I felt was rage. Without thinking, I tossed it without thinking, sending it careening into the wall and scattering into a shower of small electronic components. It was all it took to stir Abigail awake. The tears were immediate. It had been hours since she'd been given anything for the pain, and I could only imagine it was the first thing she was aware of, and the thought made my heart ache like I'd been stabbed. It was all more than she deserved. Everything. The recent speech issues and temper tantrums, the injury, everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. It felt like I was failing in every way to protect her. Painkillers. Where are her painkillers? My focus momentarily split. I scanned the various shelves of our room to the mild painkillers we'd been recommended, eventually finding them on my dresser. I rose, quickly making my way over to the little orange bottle. As I turned to make my way back, I heard it. A faint whirring click from that little white box. It was followed immediately by the sound of static, hissing like a broken television, and through the static I could hear that voice again. The distortion was greater than before, but I could hear it more clearly than ever sitting atop my bed. Little bear, don't cry. Come outside. Even with the electronic distortion, my blood ran cold. It was as though a light bulb had been set off in my head, recognition blooming amidst an equal amount of cold, sharp dread, and blazing anger. I watched in horror as Abigail slowly grew silent, eyes opening and hardly bothering to take notice of me as she seemed to search the room for the source of the voice, her eyes falling on the bear. splayed open only feet away. "Daddy?" She spoke with bleary recognition. All at once, it felt as though the struggle of the past several weeks, once appearing separate, but equally distressing issues, suddenly revealed themselves as one. I made my way to the bed quickly, scooping Abigail up as though the bear itself might take hold of her, and grabbing my phone off the bed. "Come, adventure." The hiss of distortion grew, the words in between becoming lost on the storm of sound, and yet all I could do was listen. That voice, I hated myself for not recognizing it sooner. Though we had only spoken once before, it belonged to our neighbor, the old man next door whose first name I could hardly even recall. My husband hadn't given Abigail the bear, I realized. Her father was the most present man in her life, Daddy being the only name she would think to call the voice speaking to her in the night. I opened my phone, immediately navigating to Alan's number and pressing the call button. The seconds between each ring seemed to stretch on for an eternity as I waited. "Hello?" My heart leapt at the sound of his voice. "Alan, I know what's going on," I said. So many things I wanted to say at once, my thoughts still in a whirlwind. I struggled to even determine where to begin. "Are you okay? You sound freaked out." His voice came quickly, the panic audible. "Is it happening again?" "Yes, Alan, yes, just listen. I know who's doing this. I know who gave her the bear. It was Melody, the old guy next door." There was a moment of silence from Alan's end, on which I could hear movement. "Sorry, I needed to get out of the office. What do you mean he gave it to her? I thought you—" No, we both did. We never thought to ask because of course we wouldn't. Alan, listen. I'm going to take Abby to your sister's. I want to get her away from this place. I'll call the police on the way. If you still have Officer Ramirez's number, call him too." I could feel myself speaking at a mile a minute, but felt unable to seize, moving about my bedroom just as frantically in search of my keys. On the bed, the box continued to hiss and crackle faintly, and through it all I could hear breathing and movement. "Hold on," I breathed to Alan. Ears perked as I tried to hear through the foggy audio. It sounded as though there were two voices, loud and yet far too distant for me to hope to make out anything being said. Still, even without being able to make out the exact words, I knew the sounds of an argument. The realization only hastened my search, as I tore drawers open and tossed pillows and sheets aside with my free hand, all the while Abigail screaming in my ear. Okay. Alright, I'll do it now. Just get to Tracy's, please. I'll call you back. Keep your phone close. I love you." And with that, he was gone. With a sigh of frustration, I gave the room one more look, seeing no sign of the keys before resigning to check the rest of the house. I knew that when they weren't on the bedside nightstand, most of the time they'd be found on the small table beside our garage door. I was on my way out of my room when I heard two things that made me freeze, my heart falling through the chasm I felt in my chest. There was a scream, audible through the speaker sitting amidst the cotton-strewn remains of the bear's insides, and somewhere in the distance. The hairs raised on my back at that realization that it was coming from more than just the bear. Something was screaming next door, a woman shrieking bloody. There was a bang, this time loud enough that there was no doubting whether it had been from the bear or somewhere very, very close. For a split second, I felt frozen. The sound seemed to echo, an unmistakable crack reverberating through the cul-de-sac, echoing over the speaker, which fell silent immediately after. Abigail's wails grew louder, my heart threatening to burst from my chest as I lingered in the horror of what I was certain I had just heard. The keys, I thought. Find your keys. The thought spurred me into action, pushing me forth and out of the room, as I chanced one final glance in hopes of finding them. I took the stairs as quickly and carefully as I could manage, hyper aware of the way Abby's cries grew louder with the force of our movement. My mind felt torn in a dozen directions, like holding the leads of a pack of wild dogs, and the world seemed to spin as my head grew hot with sheer panic. I hurried to the back room where the door to our garage was, and felt my heart drop as I saw nothing on the table. "Where are my keys?" I shouted, far louder than I should have so near Abigail, but the panic had frayed my nerves past the point of repair. Her tears quieted for a moment as she watched me with glossy eyes, her little face almost confused by the outburst. She looked between me and the table, and I saw that innocent little smile begin to play across her lips as she pointed with one chubby finger on her uninjured hand towards the table where I had once felt so certain they resided. "Daddy," she waved her little fist, pantomiming her favorite thing to do with either of our keys, waving them about for the noise. And in my heart, for the first time in a while somehow, I felt I understood my daughter immediately. My stomach did a complete 180, though I suddenly felt quite sure that my keys were no longer in the house, and likely hadn't been since the events of the prior afternoon. I knew I had to be certain. I racked my brain for where they could be. The kitchen was the only place I could think to look next, hurrying there with my thoughts feeling all the more scattered. There was nothing, no sign of them anywhere. I could feel a strange sort of helplessness beginning to seep in, and as I searched for some answer, without my keys, I had no way for us to get out, no way to escape the house, and if I was stuck, I needed to be certain that help was on the way. I pulled out my phone, dialing 911, and switching it to speaker. Quickly, I made my way to every door and window, ensuring each was locked, starting at the front of the house. I peered out my front window onto our street. An eerie silence seemed to have fallen over everything since the sound of the gunshot had rang out. Not even the usual odd bark could be heard. It seemed even the birds had gone into hiding. I craned my neck to see the house next door, and felt my blood run cold. Their front door sat wide open, a sight I'd never seen before at the home of Miss Melody. She was the sort I'd heard berate her husband for leaving a window open and risking a chill, and as minute a detail as it was, it felt a surreal confirmation of my fears. I sat Abby down in the living room, needing every bit of movement as I continued securing the house. It was as I arrived at the back door that a thought occurred to me, almost freezing me in motion. The police. It struck me like a bolt of lightning, the realization, I still need to call the police. I quickly pulled out my phone, working the locks with my free hand and dialing the number, setting it to speaker. I had arrived before the garage door when there was an answer, yet as I stared ahead, feeling a nightmarish sense of déjà vu like nothing I had known before, my mind felt filled by the sight of the open door before me. A breeze rolled in, up the driveway and into the house, and somehow it felt like the caress of death. With it came a single thought, laden in venom and horror that racked me with tremors. "Hello? Hello?" A man on the other end of the phone called. momentarily pulling me from my shock, though terror coursed through every inch of my being. I raised the phone to my ear, breathing my address into the receiver, and as brief a synopsis of my situation as could be managed. My final words sent a chill down my own spine. I need police as soon as possible. Please, I think he's in the house. Units are on their way, ma'am. Please stay on the line. As I stared at the open garage, I felt transported back to the day before, and with the feeling came only one thought. Abigail. I raced back towards the living room, not even bothering to shut the door behind me as I did so, my heart climbing higher into my throat with each step. As I turned the corner into the room, my eyes shot immediately to where she'd last sat on the couch. I felt my blood curdle, and struggled to bite back the scream I felt rising in my throat. Abigail sat on the couch, in her hand a stuffed pink bunny, with which she was occupied. Behind her, holding her as like he bore some familiarity, was my neighbor, Mr. Alvin Melody, as I would come to know him, sat hardly bothering to acknowledge me as I entered. His leathery face was covered in trickles of deep red, which spread along his clothes and arms, a baseball cap hanging loosely atop his thinning silver hair. I felt a fear like nothing I'd ever known, cold and sharp through my veins, along with a pain in my chest like I was being stabbed, but it all felt second to the rage. Get away from her. I hissed the words through clenched teeth, hardly even recognizing my own voice through the sheer hatred in it. I peered over at the fireplace for a moment, just behind the couch, seeing my opportunity. I hurried over and snatched the poker from its place, brandishing it like a club. Get away from her now. The last part I roared, taking another step forward and raising my impromptu weapon. He looked up at me, with eyes such a cold, lifeless blue it almost gave me chills, and sliding a single hand across the couch, bringing my attention to what sat beside him. A single 9mm handgun. Quiet now, he spoke, in a tone that was almost casual. You don't want to upset the baby. He caressed Abigail's head, the very sight making my skin crawl. I could taste blood in my mouth, alerting me to the fact that I'd been biting my tongue. Get away from her. He laughed, and it sounded genuine, and in his eyes, beneath mock civility, I could see a glimpse of something unhinged. Even backed into a corner, see how the mother bear roars for her cub? He smiled, meeting my gaze with an unwavering stare. I like you, you know? He spoke with a sort of familiarity that unmanned me. No hostility in his tone, just a cold sort of appraisal like some school principal. Unattentive, perhaps, but you're a good mother deep down. Your love for your little girl is fierce, admirable. It's a trait I wish my wife had had. He spat those final words, his expression shifting for the first time into something hateful. I had a daughter too once. Her name too was Abigail. He smiled down at Abby, who was utterly oblivious to the danger she might be in, distracted with her newest toy. I love that girl as much as a man can love, more than I'd ever known I could. I spent months, sometimes years away from home as a military man, but it was always made better knowing I was returning to this little person who looked at me as though I held up the sky. He smiled, though there appeared something behind it this time. something deeply sad as he nodded to himself. My wife, though, she never loved her like I did. Oh, she said she did, but I could tell every time I was home. She resented how close we were. His eyes narrowed as he looked at me. Sick woman she was. I got the call when I was deployed, running comms for an operation overseas that my Abby had. I could see that the man was struggling, his jaw tightening visibly. My eyes fell back on the gun. It sat perhaps a foot or so away from him. I could be no more than 4. In my head I tried to play out some situation in which I might advance on him before he could get to the weapon, either striking him with mine or taking his, without risking mine and my daughter's lives. He seemed not to notice my split attention, his own so wrapped in memories from years past, and likely the waning adrenaline and shock on his own actions. They say it was an asthma attack that took her, my Abby, but I know better. It was my wife. He hissed the words like it was venomous, staring off and out the window in the direction of his home. I inched forward, moving so lightly it made my muscles burn, but even still my heart bounded with the fear that the ground might crack beneath me. I'm sure of it, as sure as I was when I saw this little girl. I felt my stomach tighten, and fought the urge to rush forward and strike in that moment. That day you all first came to this house, and I heard her name, I knew what it meant. He smiled at me, and for the first time, any mask of civility or calm was gone. A gut-wrenching, wide-eyed fanaticism in its place. My little girl had returned. I was being given another chance. She's my daughter. I couldn't hold my tongue any longer. You have spied on our family. You took her from my house. You are sick. Rage flashed like a supernova beneath his eyes, his smile falling instantly. No, she isn't. Not anymore. And as to my devices, his lips quivered into a little grin. The bear? Of course I needed to keep an eye on her. I wasn't going to let negligence rob me of my joy again. I realized, listening to him speak, what I already knew. The man was insane, beyond any sort of reasoning. The police would surely be on the way, and at his age, how far might he go before being caught, even if he was successful? For some reason, the thought brought me no comfort. The opposite, in fact. It made me realize there was no predicting how he might respond. Don't think of it all as ill-intentioned. That bear was my Abby's long ago. She loved it, didn't she? He nodded, smiling wide. Of course she did. That's how I knew. You and your husband were very distracted on your moving day. I saw her sitting on the porch and gave it to her while the two of you directed the movers. The way she smiled, I knew in an instant. He peered down at her, and every part of me wanted to swing down with the poker, bringing it down atop his sun-leathered scalp. I fought back my instincts, instead inching forward once more. Keep him talking. It was the singular thought running through my head. What happened to Mrs. Melody? I asked, wanting to hear nothing more about my daughter from that man's mouth. He frowned momentarily, shrugging as his eyes met mine. She found out what was going on. Always has been wary of me, that one, as if our daughter didn't die on her watch. Always said I was paranoid, didn't want to hear it when I explained. Told me I was insane. He chuckled like the assertion was unthinkable. Told me I was sick. In the end, I did what I should have done all those years ago. Nothing should stand between a man and his daughter. He stared down at Abigail, planting a kiss on her hair, and it took every bit of strength I could muster to stop myself from leaping forth. Instead, I took the momentary distraction and inched forward. There was perhaps a little more than 1.5 feet between us now. If I was quick. His smile faded for a moment as he looked up at me, and for that instant, I felt my heart stop in fear that he'd seen me moving forward and had grown suspicious. But the face he wore was almost apologetic as he ran a hand over her injured arm, still wrapped from the ER visit. I assure you this wasn't my intention. I meant her no harm. Or you. Even yesterday, I was simply worried. You can understand, I'm sure, how we care for our daughters. Swing. Hit him. Kill him. Some primal, cave woman part of my brain shrieked like a chimp attacking the bars of its cage. Fighting for immediate action, I simply inched forward. I forgive you, I managed, as genuinely as I could force myself to sound. To my surprise, his smile grew at that, as he nodded fervently. Good. I knew you would. You're a good parent. You would understand. Perhaps, he began, his eyes meeting mine. Perhaps you could join me. A girl deserves a good mother, and you and I could take care of her. The distant sound of sirens suddenly echoed through the air, the room filled with a silence that buzzed with awful tension. Slowly, his expression shifted, any of the previous affection replaced by a mask of animal fury. The sirens grew louder, almost certainly somewhere down the street. You, he spat the word, face going a deep red, animated in a way that almost seemed unfit for his age. You're just like her. He turned to see the approaching vehicles. Still not visible yet, though I could see the approaching glow of police lights through windows on the neighboring houses. They were on our street now. I had to act. We could have raised her together, he roared, still staring towards the approaching vehicles as if in shell shock. Abby? I spoke, voice hardly above a whisper. Her eyes fell on mine, wavering between myself and the man, fear growing palpable on her little face. Go outside, go run, go play. I spoke, as quickly and with as much forced levity as I could manage. To my relief, she smiled, nodding and sliding off the man's lap, tottering past me and towards the open door. He turned to face me. We could have raised her happy, but because you wanted to be a fool, my Abby will have to be raised without a mommy. I saw his hand make a move for the gun. I raised the poker above my head. Everything seemed to blend into one long moment, time warping and melding and losing its meaning as there was only movement. His arm moving towards the weapon, my legs forcing themselves to close the distance. The poker raised high into the air. He grabbed the gun, making to raise it at me. It was too late. I brought my arms down with a grunt, swinging with all the force I could muster. I felt a sensation like nothing I'd known before, my arms shaking with the sudden feeling of resistance, followed by a wet crack as one of the poker's curved edges dug itself into the man's head. Our eyes locked in a moment that remains frozen in my mind, his wide and searching, almost unbelieving of the fate dawning on him. For a moment I tried to pull, yet the feeling of resistance and the gurgling sound the man began to make made me stop. Even in my hatred, that human part of me unable to go any further. His mouth opened as though to speak, yet only a faint k came forth. We stayed like that for several moments, frozen in a horrid union, until I found it in me to release the poker. His head swayed forward, then back, with an almost staggering suddenness. He dropped back onto the couch, going utterly and completely still. For several seconds that felt like minutes I stood there, processing the image of him, the reality of what I'd just done. Before taking a breath, I had no time to mourn for myself or grapple with ideological qualms. I needed only to get to my daughter. As I made my way outside, I found her sitting on the step, little pink bunny in hand, and for a moment I considered grabbing it. Instead, I watched her with a growing smile as she attempted to braid its ears like hair. I made a mental note to give it a thorough look, as I would be with all of her toys from here on out. But for now, I felt there was no rush. Even if there was a device, I had the distinct feeling there would be nobody to take advantage of it. My smile grew, a genuine expression despite the storm of emotions still under the surface. Something told me that Abby would be experiencing no more late-night outbursts. That night, after statements had been taken, Alan had arrived, and it seemed like 100 calls had been made and received. We all had our first full night of sleep in months. I love open floor layouts. When you grow up crammed in a small house with 3 other kids and your parents all sharing 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, you develop an appreciation for space. I like the breathing room. I like feeling like I can stretch out. It's like the everything the light touches scene from The Lion King. When I look at my open floor plan condo, it's a beautiful thing. Move-in was completely painless as well. As I'm on the ground floor, I've got these huge glass panes on either side of the front door. It's a real modern apartment. I've come a long way since my childhood, so it almost feels like the entire street. The open field and trees on the other side, everything out there is a part of my condo. It's all my domain, my territory. Even when I'm doing chores, I genuinely feel content just looking at it all. I get to see my neighbors walking their dogs and wildlife playing in the grass. I also harbor a great appreciation for films and television shows, so I laid out my furniture to accommodate immersion. When I'm really absorbed in a work, it's basically the only thing I don't want to be thinking about. How much I love my condo. So, across from the entrance, the TV stands against the wall, and the couch in between, facing the TV, of course. The kitchen's off to my left, the door to my bedroom is past the dining area to my right. Because of the limited distance between my couch and my TV, my field of view is mostly taken up by the screen. The glare can get annoying on a sunny day due to the aforementioned glass panes by the entrance, but I mostly watch in the evenings, so the trade-off is worth it to me. All I see is the TV. Last night, I was watching a period piece drama that took place in 19th century England. It's great junk food TV for when I get home from work and I don't really want to use my brain. The camera work can be a bit lazy, but the actors look nice and the costumes are really detailed. Consequently, I don't mind when the camera lingers on a shot for a little too long. Moments like that can be immersive in their own way. I felt my eyes start to put up a fight. But there was one episode left in the season, so I decided to stick it out and watch it. Midway through the episode, it happened. I fell asleep. It happens. I can't always force myself awake even when I'm engaged with the story. Never one to admit defeat, I tried to rewind to where I slipped out of consciousness. My entertainment system had other plans. For some reason, I couldn't rewind past a certain point about 5 minutes after I passed out. It was a dialogue scene, a medium profile shot of a girl in a frilly dress and a man in a very nice suit against a floral wallpaper. I tried mashing the button, but if I'd hit a wall in the playback, I wasn't supposed to be doing this. The intrigue woke me up fully, and I restarted the entire system. When I hit resume on the show, it put me right back at the point, and the same problem happened again. I hit play to see if it would do anything, and as the characters began discussing their mutual friend, my remote stopped working entirely. There was no useful guidance to be gained from a couple Google searches, so I gave up. I put my phone back in my pocket and looked up, only to be met with silence and both of the on-screen characters making direct eye contact with the camera. Dead silent. Blank expressions. It felt like they were actually looking at me. When had they stopped talking? I hadn't noticed. For a moment, I thought I might have accidentally paused it, but I could see them breathing. This had never happened in the entire run of the show. I had no idea what was going on. The girl's expression shifted slightly to this subdued sadness, almost disappointment, like someone at a call center having to scam yet another elderly person out of their retirement. My stomach dropped. Her arms slowly raised, in fits and starts, pointing at the camera, pointing behind me. I felt every nerve in my body charge, a horrible pulse of the most ugly and vicious dread I have ever felt. My hands and feet felt like ice. My neck felt exposed. I was too aware of the skin on the back of my skull tightening up. I had to look. The glass panes. A man standing just to the right of my door, just outside. His nose too high on his face, unnaturally long philtrum, thin, wide lips, his hands between his brow and the glass, leaning in, peering in, peeping, watching, looking, staring right at me, and my body was ice. A sort of hyper-awareness. I felt the air in my condo like it was part of my body, like my nerves extended out and beyond my form and stretched into the cavernous room. The precious space between he and I felt every disturbance. I could see everything, hear everything. I was so in the moment that it seemed to stretch on forever. It only lasted milliseconds before every muscle in my body contracted and I let loose from my throat a distorted white noise, a scraping or scratching scream I've never screamed before. I scrambled to my feet and he just watched. I looked around my apartment for something I could use to defend myself, but finding nothing, I looked back to see him moving away. His legs somehow moving his torso with no sway, no bob, perfectly evenly, as if he was sliding, but you could see his legs taking him, carrying him away, and he didn't break eye contact. Not for a second, not for a moment, not for anything. I never wanted so badly to curl into a ball and cry and just not exist. Could I even call the cops? He didn't commit a crime. I looked to my kitchen, finding the knives, and in my peripheral vision I saw it. His face was on my screen. 2 of them, imposed on the characters on my TV, still pointing. My head swiveling, turning like a top on a table. Rotation, centrifugal force exercising slightly on my eyes and nose and the protrusion of the back of my skull. My hair pushed by the air that wanted to stay still. And he was there, just behind my couch, just feet away from me, still with his hands positioned like he was looking through glass. The door unopened. My panic gripped me and I just fell over. Genuinely fainted. Today, I awoke and found my TV missing. It was the only thing missing. The police came to my house, looked around. I told them about the man's appearance and behavior, but I left out the images I saw on my TV. The strange blurring of my reality in those moments. I don't think it really matters. I don't even know if it was real. Maybe it was my subconscious filling in the blanks of knowing there was someone watching me. I don't know. Is such a thing possible? Can you tell when someone's watching you?